The air in courtroom 3B of the Magnolia County Courthouse was a toxic cocktail of stale coffee, old paper, and the low-grade, simmering anxiety of people waiting for judgment. It was a room that felt forgotten by time, with water-stained ceilings and oak benches worn smooth by decades of anonymous misery. Presiding over it all from a bench that looked more like a fortress was Judge Alistair Fane. For 30 years, Fane had ruled this space not as the arbiter of justice, but as the absolute monarch of his own decaying kingdom. He was a man whose youthful idealism had long ago curdled into a bitter, unyielding rigidity. He saw the law not as a tool for fairness, but as a cudgel to enforce order, his order. His face was a mask of perpetual disapproval, his eyes two chips of ice that missed nothing and forgave less. Elias Thorne, a senior attorney for the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, felt the oppressive weight of the room the moment he stepped inside. He glanced at his watch. 8:51 a.m. He was 11 minutes late, a rarity that grated on his disciplined nature. An emergency call about a cross-state voter suppression case had delayed him, forcing him to rush here for a personal matter, a hearing on a property tax dispute involving the small house his grandmother had left him. That house was more than wood and nails. It was the crucible of his conscience, the place where a formidable old woman had taught him that justice was not something you were given, but something you demanded. He slipped into a seat at the back, his gaze immediately finding the judge. He'd read the file on Fane. He knew the reputation. And as he watched the judge dismiss a young, terrified mother's plea for a payment plan with a contemptuous wave of his hand, Elias knew the warnings hadn't been exaggerated. A text from a colleague earlier that morning had been blunt. Watch yourself with Fane. He's got a special kind of venom for black men in sharp suits. Elias wasn't worried, not exactly, he was prepared. But the cold reality of the judge's petty tyranny was more stark than he'd anticipated. This was no longer just about a tax bill. This was about the sanctity of his grandmother's legacy, a legacy of fighting men, exactly like the one sitting on that bench. The judge's cold eyes swept the room and landed on him a silent, imperious summons. Elias stood his face a calm, unreadable mask. The battle had already begun. Before we witness this explosive clash between a man who enforces the rules and a man who embodies the law, tell us in the comments what you would do when faced with such an abuse of power. And if you believe that one person's courage can change a system, make sure you subscribe and hit that bell for more stories that matter. Case number 734. Thorne Judge Fane's voice cut through the room, dry and sharp as shattered glass. Let's get on with it. Elias walked to the plaintiff's table, his steps measured and confident. He placed his briefcase down, adjusted his tie, and met the judge's icy glare without flinching. "Good morning, Your Honor. Elias Thorne for the—" "You're late," Fane snapped, cutting him off. The words were not an observation, they were an accusation. This court sessions begin at 8:40, not 8:51. Not whenever you feel like gracing us with your presence. My apologies. Your Honor, Elias said, his voice a model of professional composure. I was detained by an urgent matter related to a federal investigation. It was unavoidable. Unavoidable. Fane echoed, leaning forward. A cruel smirk played on his lips. Everything is unavoidable to people who believe their time is more important than everyone else's. Here, Mr. Thorne, we follow rules. They are not suggestions. Your tardiness shows a profound disrespect for this court and for the time of every person in this room. The courtroom fell into a tense silence. At her station, the court clerk, Clara Vance, felt a familiar knot of anger tighten in her stomach. She'd seen this show 100 times. Across the room, Judge Evelyn Reed, Fane's longtime colleague, sat observing. She knew Alistair's tirades were less about punctuality and more about power. She'd seen his bitterness grow over the years, ever since a failed crusade against local corruption had left him isolated and cynical. She saw the injustice, but years of self-preservation had taught her that speaking up would only make her his next target. "You are fined $1,000 for contempt of court Fane," declared, his tone one of absolute finality, payable by the end of the day. Elias took a slow, deep breath, caging the hot flare of anger that rose in his chest. "Your Honor, with all due respect, a fine of that magnitude for an 11-minute delay seems disproportionate, especially given the professional exigency I explained." Disproportionate Fane's eyes narrowed to slits. "I'll be the judge of that. That is, after all, my job. Perhaps you should learn to follow rules before you attempt to practice law. Now state your case, or I'll hold you in contempt again for wasting more of my time." The insult was deliberate, a clear jab at Elias's professionalism and dignity. As Elias began to outline the details of the tax error, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He overheard a whisper from the gallery behind him. An elderly man murmured to his wife, "He never talks to the white lawyers like that. Never." The words were swallowed by the oppressive silence as Fane's glare swept the room. Elias pressed on, but his mind was already working on a different track. Just 10 minutes later, a harried-looking man in a wrinkled suit rushed into the courtroom, clearly just as late as Elias had been. "My apologies, Judge Cartrouble," the man stammered. Fane simply waved a hand. "Sit down, Mr. Albright. We'll get to you. No fine, no lecture, no contempt charge." The disparity was so blatant, so shameless, it took Elias's breath away. This wasn't just a pattern, it was a policy. He thought of an old classmate who had told him a story about being fined double for a minor traffic violation in this very courtroom while Fane mocked his choice of car. At the time, it had been a story of injustice. Now sitting here, Elias saw it as a piece of a much larger, uglier puzzle. This wasn't just a single bad judge. This was a sickness in the heart of the system allowed to fester through the silence of people like Evelyn Reed. Elias's resolve hardened. He was no longer here about a house. He was here to burn down a kingdom built on prejudice. He finished his presentation on the tax issue, his arguments clear and concise. Fane listened with feigned interest, then issued a ruling without comment. "The clerk will note the court's decision." Next case. But Elias didn't move. "One moment, Your Honor." Fane looked up annoyed. "We're done here, Mr. Thorne." "I'm afraid we're not." "Elias," said his voice calm, but now infused with a new, steely authority. "Before I leave, I feel it's my duty to introduce myself properly. I am Elias Thorne, a senior trial attorney with the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. My work for the last 12 years has focused exclusively on cases of judicial misconduct and systemic discrimination." A ripple of shock went through the courtroom. The clerk, Clara Vance, looked up from her keyboard, her eyes wide. Judge Evelyn Reed sat up straighter. Judge Fane's face, for the first time, lost its mask of bored arrogance and flickered with uncertainty. I failed to see the relevance of your resume. Fane said, his voice tight. The relevance? Your Honor. Elias continued, his voice echoing in the stunned silence, is that I cannot help but notice a series of troubling inconsistencies in the application of this court's rules this morning alone. Which brings me to a question of judicial ethics. Are you familiar with Canon 2 of the Code of Conduct for United States judges, which states that a judge should act at all times in a manner that promotes public confidence in the integrity and impartiality of the judiciary? The room was utterly still. This was no longer a defendant being scolded. This was a high-level federal attorney challenging a judge on the record in his own courtroom. The air crackled with tension. You are walking a very dangerous line. Counsel. Fane hissed, his voice a low threat. This is not your federal courtroom. Here I am, the authority on the rules, and I am not questioning your authority. Your Honor, Elias countered smoothly, I am questioning whether that authority is being applied impartially. Because from where I stand, it appears that the rules in this courtroom are dependent on the defendant's race, and that Your Honor is not just a violation of the canons of conduct, it is a violation of the 14th Amendment. Fane's face was a thundercloud of fury. He opened his mouth to retort, to deliver another charge of contempt, but his eyes darted around the room and saw that he had lost it. The faces staring back at him were no longer fearful or passive. They were watchful, expectant. An elderly woman in the front row, a community activist named Maria Flores, met his gaze and gave a slow, deliberate nod, not to him, but to Elias. Enough! Fane finally roared, striking his gavel with such force that it seemed to shake the bench. Return to your seat, Mr. Thorne. Now, Elias nodded slowly. His point made, he returned to his seat, not as a defeated man, but as a warrior who had just landed the first decisive blow. He had seen the flicker of panic in the tyrant's eyes, and he knew a much larger battle was now inevitable. As the session adjourned, Elias left the courtroom with a calm exterior, but inside, a fire of cold-controlled fury was raging. He knew what he had to do. Back in the quiet of his hotel room, which now served as a temporary war room, Elias began to draft a formal complaint to the state's Judicial Oversight Commission. But he knew a complaint on its own would be buried under months of bureaucratic inertia. To bring down a man like Fane, he needed an arsenal. He needed data documents and witnesses. He thought of Clara Vance, the court clerk. He'd seen the look in her eyes, not fear, but a weary, simmering anger. The next afternoon, he found her in her small, cluttered office, a space that smelled of ink and quiet desperation. Ms. Vance, Elias began, his tone gentle. My name is Elias Thorne. I was in court yesterday. She looked up, her expression guarded. I know who you are, Mr. Thorne. Your introduction was memorable. I need your help, he said directly. What's happening in that courtroom is wrong. I believe you know it, and I believe you're tired of being silent. Clara stared at him, a conflict raging in her eyes. I'm a clerk. I file papers. What can I do? He's a judge, a powerful one. You are there every day, Elias pressed. You see everything, you hear everything. I'm not asking you to be a hero. I'm asking you to help me find the truth. He paused, then added, my own family has seen what happens when men like him go unchallenged. This isn't just a case for me. That resonated. Clara was silent for a long time. Finally, she took a deep breath, a decision made. My nephew? she said, her voice barely a whisper. He got 5 years from Fane for a non-violent first offense. His public defender told us it was a lost cause. I see boys who look just like him get probation every week. She unlocked a drawer in her desk and pulled out a thick, worn ledger. I started keeping my own records a few years ago. Dates, names, charges, sentences. I don't know if it's legal, but I couldn't not. Elias took the ledger, his heart pounding. It was a treasure trove, a meticulous, handwritten indictment of Fane's reign. Clara, this is more than just helpful, he said, his voice thick with gratitude. This is courage. Be careful, Mr. Thorne, she warned. Fane has friends. Powerful ones. He won't go down without a fight. Armed with the ledger, Elias reached out to his DOJ colleague Marcus Cole. But Marcus was cautious. Elias, I get it. The man is a disgrace. But you're poking a bear with deep political connections. An official investigation will get stonewalled. You'll be painted as an overzealous Fed with a personal vendetta. Then we don't make it an official investigation, yet, Elias countered. We make it a public one. With Clara's data as a foundation, Elias began working late into the night, cross-referencing her notes with public court records. The pattern was undeniable and sickening. Black defendants received sentences that were on average 250% harsher than those for white defendants for similar crimes. But the data needed a human face. He thought of Maria Flores, the activist from the courtroom. He found her at a local community center, a place his own grandmother would have loved. He laid out his case, and Maria, a woman with fire in her eyes, and a network built over 50 years of fighting for her neighborhood, immediately understood. People have been afraid of that man for too long, she said, her voice ringing with conviction. It's time to make some noise. She didn't write a blog post. She did something more powerful. She used her weekly community newsletter, a paper read by thousands in the city, to print an open letter. It detailed Elias's experience, cited the anonymous data of a brave court insider, and invited others who had been victims of Judge Fane's justice to share their stories at a town hall meeting. The response was a tidal wave. The newsletter spread like wildfire. The hashtag #Fane's fallacy began trending locally. People who had suffered in silence for years began to speak out in the comments, their stories a heartbreaking chorus of injustice. The town hall held in the basement of Maria's church was standing room only. One by one, people stood up a father whose son was in jail for a minor parole violation, a woman who had lost her home over an inflated fine, a young man whose life had been derailed by a biased sentence. The local news picked up the story, then a regional paper. Suddenly, Judge Fane wasn't just a courtroom bully. He was the center of a growing firestorm. As the pressure mounted, Elias knew his enemies would not stay silent. One evening, a sleek black car parked across the street from his hotel. It just sat there for hours, a silent, menacing presence. The next day, he received an anonymous email. You think you're a hero? You're a dead man walking. Back off. The threat, instead of intimidating him, galvanized him. It was a sign of desperation. They're afraid, he thought, which means I'm getting close. He knew this was no longer just about Fane. It was about the entire rotten structure that allowed men like him to flourish. And now, he wasn't fighting alone. He had an army of ordinary people behind him, and their voices were getting louder every day. The anonymous threat only confirmed to Elias that he was striking a nerve deep within the city's power structure. He knew that data and public outrage were powerful, but to force the hand of the Judicial Oversight Commission, he needed something more. He needed an insider from the judiciary itself to break the code of silence. He needed Judge Evelyn Reed. He met her in her chambers, a room that, unlike Fane's courtroom, was filled with books, art, and an air of quiet intellect. She was a woman of small stature but immense presence, her silver hair styled impeccably. She listened to him without interruption, her face a mask of careful neutrality. Elias, I've worked alongside Alistair Fane for 30 years, she said, when he had finished, her voice low and measured. I am aware of his rigidities, but to formally testify against a sitting colleague, that is a momentous step, Judge Reed Elias said, leaning forward, his gaze intense. I've read your early work. Your law review articles on judicial ethics were required reading when I was at Yale. The woman who wrote those articles believed that silence in the face of injustice is a form of complicity. Is that woman still here? Ill. Evelyn was silent for a long moment, her eyes distant. He saw a flicker of the firebrand she once was, warring with the pragmatist she had become. The system has a way of wearing you down, Mr. Thorne, she finally whispered. Alistair. He wasn't always like this. He was betrayed by people he trusted during that corruption probe decades ago. It broke something in him. He replaced his faith in justice with a faith in absolute control. I understand that, Elias said gently, but his tragedy does not excuse his tyranny. His pain doesn't give him the right to inflict it on thousands of others. We cannot allow his history to be an alibi for his present. Her resolve seemed to harden. You are right, she said, her voice regaining its strength. I have been silent for too long. I will testify. Evelyn's agreement was a critical victory. As his team continued to dig, they unearthed a bombshell from the court archives. A sealed case from 8 years prior involving a major real estate developer accused of massive fraud. Judge Fane had overseen the case and inexplicably had handed down a sentence that amounted to a slap on the wrist, a token fine. The file was thin, but Clara Vance, using her knowledge of the archive system, found a misfiled document, a former clerk's sworn but never submitted affidavit. It detailed a private, off-the-record meeting between Fane and the developer's attorneys just days before the verdict. It hinted at a substantial bribe. The clerk who wrote it had resigned abruptly and moved out of state a week later. This was the smoking gun. Fane wasn't just a bigot, he was corrupt. This wasn't just about bias, it was about crime. With Evelyn's testimony secured and the evidence of corruption in hand, the Judicial Oversight Commission had no choice but to convene an official public hearing. The news sent shockwaves through the city's legal community. Fane, once untouchable, was now facing a public trial for his career. The day of the hearing, the room was packed to capacity. The harsh fluorescent lights gleamed off the polished wood, creating a sterile, unforgiving atmosphere. Judge Alistair Fane entered, his face a stony mask, but his eyes held a flicker of something new, apprehension. This was not his courtroom. He was not in control. Elias sat at the prosecutor's table, a mountain of files before him. Beside him, Evelyn Reed and Clara Vance sat with quiet, resolute dignity. This was no longer just Elias's fight. It was a reckoning for the entire Magnolia legal system. The chairperson of the commission, a formidable woman with a reputation for impartiality, opened the proceedings. Judge Fane, you are here today to answer allegations of judicial misconduct, systemic bias, and potential corruption. You may begin with a statement. Fane rose his imposing figure, the last remnant of his former power. I have served this city for 31 years. He began, his voice slow and deliberate. I have always acted with one goal in mind, to maintain order and the sanctity of the law. My methods may be stern, but they are born of a commitment to a system I believe in. When it was his turn, Elias walked to the podium. He didn't look at the files. He looked directly at Fane. Honorable Committee. We are not here to debate Judge Fane's commitment to order. We are here to examine the cost of that order. And the evidence will show that the cost has been borne almost exclusively by the most vulnerable members of our community. He began, not with statistics, but with a story, the story of Clara's nephew. He then presented the ledger, the cold, hard data of disparate sentencing. He projected charts showing the undeniable racial bias. With every piece of evidence, another crack appeared in Fane's facade. These are not unintentional mistakes, Elias declared, his voice ringing through the room. When a pattern of discrimination persists for decades, it is not a mistake. It is a philosophy. It is a system. The climax came when he called Judge Evelyn Reed to the stand. She detailed Fane's methods of intimidation, how he pressured colleagues to fall in line. He would call it maintaining standards. She said, her voice filled with regret, but we all knew it was about maintaining his absolute control. Finally, Elias brought up the real estate developer case. He presented the former clerk's affidavit. Judge Fane, can you explain the private meeting you had with the defense just days before you handed down a lenient sentence in a major fraud case? Fane's composure finally shattered. That is a baseless accusation. A disgruntled employee. Is it Elias? Countered his voice like ice. Or is it a pattern? A pattern of serving not justice, but power. Whether it's the power of racial prejudice or the power of a wealthy developer, the principle is the same. You have used your bench to protect the powerful and punish the powerless. He turned to Fane, his eyes blazing. I've read your old writings, Judge, the ones where you championed the idea of a blind, impartial justice. What happened to that man? Did he die? Or did you just decide his ideals were too inconvenient for the kingdom you wanted to build? Fane stared at him, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. He was a man, hollowed out, his defenses stripped away, leaving only the bitter shell of his hypocrisy. I was wrong, he finally whispered the confession, barely audible but heard by everyone. It was the sound of an empire falling. The room erupted in hushed murmurs. Elias stood tall, his gaze never leaving Fane. You were wrong, he repeated, his voice slow and heavy. And your wrongdoing is not just a personal failure. It is an indictment of a system that allowed you to flourish. You owe this community more than an apology. You owe them the justice you denied for 30 years. The sound of the chairperson's gavel felt like the final nail in the coffin of Fane's career. The reckoning had come. Just days after the hearing, Judge Alistair Fane submitted his resignation. The official statement was terse, citing personal reasons, but the city knew the truth. An era of quiet tyranny had ended, not with a bang, but with the weight of irrefutable evidence. Elias Thorne felt no sense of triumph, only a sober understanding that this was just the beginning. Fane's departure didn't heal the wounds his reign had inflicted. It merely stopped the bleeding. Real change began to ripple through the Magnolia courthouse. Pressured by the Commission's findings and relentless public scrutiny, the court leadership initiated sweeping reforms. The most significant was the creation of a new independent civilian oversight committee tasked with reviewing sentencing data and judicial conduct. And in a move that signaled a true shift in power, Clara Vance was appointed as its first director. At her swearing-in, she stood before the court staff, her voice trembling but strong. "I used to believe that silence was the safest path," she said. "But I've learned that silence is the soil in which injustice grows. From today, we will be a garden of transparency." The community, energized by their victory, didn't retreat. Maria Flores organized a new group, the Magnolia Justice Alliance, a grassroots organization dedicated to holding the system accountable. They held Know Your Rights workshops in her church basement and started a court-watching program. Elias, though his work was technically done, attended their first meeting, standing quietly in the back. Maria called him to the front. "What we have achieved is not the work of one lawyer," he told the packed room. "It is the victory of everyone who refused to be silent. But this is the start of the marathon, not the finish line. Justice is a journey we must all walk together every single day." The story of Magnolia became a case study, a lesson in how a community, a brave insider, and a dedicated lawyer could dismantle a corrupt institution. Elias was invited to speak at law schools and legal conferences. He didn't speak of his victory, but of the struggle, the fear, and the moral clarity required to challenge entrenched power. He told them that ethics wasn't a chapter in a textbook. It was a daily conscious choice. He received a letter from a young law student in another state. It read, "Mr. Thorne, I was on the verge of quitting. I thought the system was too broken. Your story reminded me why I started. You made me believe that the law isn't just a set of rules. It's a weapon for the people. Thank you for showing us how to fight." Elias read the letter, a profound sense of purpose settling over him. In his modest DOJ office, he framed the $1,000 contempt of court receipt from Judge Fain. To anyone else, it was a piece of paper. To him, it was a symbol, a reminder that any injustice, no matter how small it seems, is a thread in the larger fabric of a system. And pulling that one thread can unravel the entire tapestry. Below it, he taped a handwritten note. "Justice is not given. It is demanded." The journey had been long, but looking back, Elias saw not a series of victories, but a chain of human connection. The courage of his grandmother, the bravery of Clara Vance, the late-blooming integrity of Evelyn Reed, the fiery spirit of Maria Flores. These were the pillars upon which justice in Magnolia was being rebuilt. The final chapter of this transformation was the inauguration of the Magnolia Justice Center, a new institution dedicated to ethics training and community outreach. As Elias stood at the podium to give the keynote address, he saw a figure standing silently at the very back of the crowd, Alistair Fain. He was older, greyer, stripped of his robes and his power. He didn't speak, but his presence was a quiet, haunting admission. Elias gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Redemption was a long road, but showing up was the first step. Elias looked out at the faces before him, students, lawyers, activists, citizens. This center is not a monument to a victory, he concluded. It is a workshop. It is a promise that we will never again mistake silence for peace. We will demand better, not just from our judges, but from ourselves. Elias Thorne's story serves as a powerful testament to the fact that systems are not faceless monolithic entities. They are collections of people making choices. And when one person makes the courageous choice to speak truth to power, it can empower countless others to do the same. The question isn't whether injustice exists. It's what we choose to do when we stand face to face with it. One person can't fix the world, but they can light a fire that illuminates the path for everyone else. Thank you for watching. If this story of courage and accountability inspired you, please hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments. To ensure you don't miss our next story, subscribe to the channel and join a community dedicated to believing in a better world. We'll see you next time.